I'm going to do a video on reincarnation in the Bible, and I'm working on putting together the
That'll be
details on that. Figure that might be something that people would be interested in. Okay, we'll continue lessons on white magic. We're finally getting near the end of Rule 11, and he's talking about death and salvation from death. And remember, when he talks about salvation from death here, he's not talking about obtaining an immortal resurrection, but he's talking about handling death in such a way that death does not sting, as the Bible says, and that we can move from life to death in comfort, and that we can overcome the fear of death. He talks about how important it is to understand it correctly, and that death is feared, but he says it's one of the most beneficial occurrences in the life cycle. And death, if we could realize it, he says, is one of the most practiced activities. We have died many times and shall die many times again and again. Death is essentially a matter of consciousness. We are conscious one moment on the physical plane, and a moment later we have withdrawn onto another plane and are actively conscious there. Just as long as our consciousness is identified with a form aspect, death will hold its ancient terror. Just as soon as we know ourselves to be souls, he says, and find that we are capable of focusing our consciousness or a sense of awareness on any form, on any plane at will, or in any direction within the form of God, we shall no longer know death, and we shall no longer have any fear of death. What produces fear more than anything else is the unknown. For instance, if you just don't know what's going to happen, then you fear what will happen. You can maybe think of all the things that we fear, and there's always some unknown quantity to it, just about always. Now, sometimes we fear something we know for sure will happen, like if a guy's going to get executed the next day and he knows it's going to get executed, say some criminal, well, he's probably going to be afraid, but a lot of that fear will still kick back to the unknown. He doesn't know what's going to happen to him after he dies, and that produces extra fear for him. So there's always some quantity of unknown. So the more we know, the more we can overcome that fear of death. And not everyone has the power to psychic power to look into the next world, or to be aware of what's going on there, or to have full soul contact. But there is one thing that all of us do have an awareness of, and that is the life force or the spirit within ourselves. Look within yourself. If you just feel your own presence, feel your own presence. And when you feel your own presence of your true self, then you'll feel an assurance that that true self cannot die. It cannot be extinguished. It can sleep, but it can't be extinguished. And if a person reflects upon himself and upon his own life, and this is one of the benefits of meditations that people do, they get a sense of their true self. When a person gets a sense of his true self, he will then have a sense of immortality, that he will continue to strive to exist, to live, to move ahead, to conquer new worlds, to have new goals, and this will never end. For instance, I'm like 74 now, so who knows how much longer I have, but I still make goals for myself just as much as I did when I was younger, probably even more. So I make goals for myself as if I'm going to live forever. And this is what we should do as disciples. Uh, Whereas the tendency of a lot of people when they reach retirement age is they think, well, probably got 10 more years to live, so I would kind of plan around that or whatever, or 10 or 20 maybe. And so this is a wrong approach. We need to plan ahead also, not only this life, but the next life. So plan ahead in such a way that you're preparing yourself not only for the remainder of this life, but also for your interlude between lives and also for your next life. Because there's a lot of goals that you have now that you're developing as a disciple that you will not be able to fulfill in this physical body, but you will be able to at a future time. And if you do this, you create a creative thread. So that thread will be there when you're born again in a new physical body. You will be able to establish positive goals earlier in life and accomplish quite a bit more at an earlier age if you plan with eternity in mind at this moment. Okay, that's important. People that are born with just where they just float around, they don't know what they're going to do. They're just feel kind of lost. It's because when they died in their last life, they kind of saw it as the end. When they died, and at that moment they see their life as the end, then they have a hard time making a new beginning in their future life. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. He says, for many, death is a great unknown to be feared. And he reminds us that people are apt to forget that every night in the hours of sleep, we actually die to the physical plane and are alive and functioning elsewhere. We just do not recall everything that's happening during sleep. Death is just a longer interval of sleep, he says, which engenders no fear at all. The only difference between death and sleep is that life is a thread that connects us and we return to our body after sleep. So there's the life thread differentiates into two streams. The first is anchored in the head and the second is anchored in the heart. And when you go to sleep, the one that is anchored in the head is released and the mental part of yourself goes back to your soul. Okay. And when it returns, because it's not, when it's in the soul, it's disconnected completely from the body. Normally, you will not remember where your mind went when you went to sleep. But your mind was doing all kinds of interesting things in connection with your soul. And it is possible to recall that, but very, very difficult, takes a lot of focused attention on the part of the disciple. But we do have impressions that come to us about things that light and activity that you did with your soul during your sleep. So during the next day, you may have impressions come to you that uh, are reaping the benefit of your union with your soul during sleep. So that comes more with impressions. Besides, the pure energy of the soul doesn't think in English or Spanish or whatever language we're in the way we do. It thinks more in concepts. So if you want to draw all the advantages of what you learn during sleep, we need to develop the intuitive part of our minds. so that you can focus on impressions, because an impression can be is like a package. It's a package that can contain a whole book of that could be written. So during the day, after you wake up, uh, see what impressions come to you, and the one of the best times to do this is just as you're waking up. As you're waking up from your sleep, it's good to just, I always like to lay there about 10 minutes and kind of absorb uh, what I might have got from my soul. And so just try to time yourself so you have about 10 minutes just to lay there between sleep and awake before you get up. And during those 10 minutes, just see what impressions come to you. Now, the other part of yourself that's still connected is your heart center is connected, and it stays connected during sleep. So during waking hours, you have two connections, mind and heart, and during sleeping hours, you have one connection for your physical body, and that's your heart. Your heart is your feeling nature. Your mind is gone, and that's why dreams make very little sense and you don't have power of decision making normally unless you're a lucid dreamer. Um, but you don't have power of decision making because your mind is elsewhere, and so your dreams don't make a lot of sense. So during these 10 minutes, if you have an interesting dream, fine, focus on it, but go beyond your dreams rather than focus on your dreams. Try to put your attention on uh, your head centers and see what kind of impressions come to you. Also, focus on your head center and see what kind of images might come to you. And if you had some interesting experience with your soul, you might get some interesting impressions. He says a heart center creates the will to be and gives the body its form and uses the blood linked to the endocrine system in order to make a man a living, conscious, functioning entity. And the consciousness thread uses the nadis and the 7 centers of force, and then the nervous system, and then the endocrine system. The endocrine system, he says, is the densest part uh, that the soul uh, sends energy to. Now, as far as death goes, he says it's merely a withdrawal of not one stream. It's sleep, you withdraw one stream, and you experience a mini death. But death, actual death, both streams are severed, the heart and the mind. And when the heart is severed, then it's normally quite permanent. And then the consciousness returns to the soul. And he he points out. He talks a little bit about the life principle, and he says that science has never been able to explain what life is. And he talks about life itself as a great mystery. Life is we're linked to our source, who is God, by life. We have our life, we owe it to one great life of which we're a part of. But he talks about a great mystery behind life itself, that how life works is something that science doesn't understand, and even most advanced disciples don't just get a glimpse of what life is. Life is strongly linked to light itself, and uh, It's interesting, there's a Mormon scripture, it says, in the beginning we were intelligence or the light of truth, it says. So the light of truth is an interesting phrase to reflect on as to its linkage with life itself. Okay, any questions or comments so far before we move ahead? He says with dementia or Alzheimer's, the thread ceases its link to the brain, but remains with the heart. The soul continues to function on its own plane. So when people get older, they get a little dementia, they get kind of out of it. He says that they've pretty much gone to the next world already. And the main link that's functioning is a link to the heart center. So they're kind of in like a dream state, kind of like the person that's dreaming. He still has his link to the heart center, still sees the images, but doesn't see everything clearly. And this is the way it is when people get old and or they get maybe injured and unconscious or semi-conscious. They their soul is actually their life force, their consciousness is actually with their soul. So when we see these people that are in this type of condition, it's kind of sad that the big strain is on the people that have to take care of them. They're the ones that suffer, whereas the person is really back with the soul, and the true entity is not even in the body. But we take care of the body sometimes 5 or 10 years where the person is incapacitated mentally. And so he's off in the world, not caring the world, whereas the caregivers are suffer a lot more than he does, which is interesting. He does have his brain. What's interesting about it, he has his brain consciousness, and his brain's like a computer. So he can respond as if the personality is still there to some degree, even if it isn't there. Even if the entity isn't there, his computer brain kind of simulates uh, the person. So the caregiver feels that the person is still there. Now the person from the soul, say if he needs care because of Alzheimer's or dementia, he may actually return for short periods of time to visit the family members. And you'll notice that if you've ever cared for somebody with dementia, that they'll have short periods where they seem to be themselves again, and then they're gone. And that's just because they've decided to make an extra effort from the soul level to uh, come back and communicate with the family again. Okay.
JJ?
Yeah.
I had an experience with my grandmother, my paternal grandmother. She had Alzheimer's. And I remember going to see her. At one point, she was very severe at that point. Pretty much a child, had to be taken care of.
Yeah.
Diapers, couldn't speak, had to be fed. And I just remember at one point I went in to, I think I was feeding her or something. And for a split second, it's like she was fully conscious and we had this connection. But what I sensed from her, and maybe you can give me some insight, was fear and a desire to communicate and not be able to, and confusion.
Yeah, well, she probably made an effort from the soul level to come down, but when her consciousness came down in the body, she didn't have full soul consciousness, and that's why she still had some fear, because she lost the soul consciousness, even though she made an effort from the soul level to come down. But it's like we're here, we are souls in incarnation right now, but we do not have the full consciousness of the soul, even though we may be healthy individuals. Uh, we're not healthy from the soul level, so to speak, because we come down here and we're extremely limited. But that limitation produces opportunity for growth for us. So we're limited on purpose so that we will be challenged to remove those limitations and succeed. But anyway, yeah, she don't let it bother you that she seemed to have some fear, because when her consciousness jerked back into her troubled body, she it would have been difficult for her. But okay, is that help at all?
Yeah, thanks, JJ.
Yeah. He says a highly developed individual will often be aware of the approach of death, and some will consciously release themselves from their body as did Christ. Then they will have no break in consciousness. Remember, Jesus on the cross, he says, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. So he actually decided his moment of death. So when an advanced soul, he says, approaches a time when his body isn't really serving its purpose anymore, he can just decide on his moment of release. And when he makes this decision, it says it will give him an advantage of keeping more of his consciousness with him for future endeavors. And DK points out the importance of the continuity of consciousness, so that when you're born in your next life, you will be able to reap the benefits of your consciousness from your last life. Now, some people have a very small handful actually remember their past lives consciously without any regression techniques. They're few and far between. And he talks about continuity of consciousness. And continuity of consciousness is more than remembering past lives. It's retaining the wisdom from your past lives, what you learned from your past lives, so you can take that learning and intelligence and preserve it, so that you have the right instincts to move forward in your current new life. And so that's a big part of the continuity consciousness. In other words, your your level of attainment that you attain in this life, you keep with you, so you don't lose that attainment in your next life. And you usually, the disciple usually reacquires all of his attainment and talents and abilities by the age of 21. And so anyway, yeah, and think back to your evolution from the time you attain self-consciousness, maybe about 3-4 years of age, to the age of 21. And you went through a lot of evolution during that period. And what you do, you go through uh, everything. You repeat in miniature everything, all your evolution from the beginning of being human to your current life. And so it's interesting to reflect on how you thought and felt from the time you were a little child to the time that you were 21. It's not always exactly 21, but it's around that age, around 28 for sure. It's your consciousness is solidified, and you're off to entirely new avenues of learning if you're following your soul. He says advanced individuals will be able to communicate telepathically. They'll, again, you probably never met anyone that can read your mind completely, but telepathic communication, when he talks about this, is more than just reading words. It's picking up impressions. Um, like I say, if somebody is visiting you and they're overdoing their welcome, they will often not be able to pick up that you wish they would go. Others can pick it up when it's time to go, and that's just a interesting telepathic thing that common people experience. But as we develop our telepathic abilities, you get more and more of the sense of impression about what people are thinking and feeling. But you have to tune into them. Even if you're quite sensitive, if your mind is somewhere else, you may not pick things up. But you have to pay attention to what you're doing, what other people are thinking. Okay, two things work against this interplay, he says. One is the grief and violent emotional upset of those left behind. In the case of the average human being, the other is man's ignorance and bewilderment as he stands faced by what are to him new conditions. So, grief and emotional upset of those left behind. This is a big problem that is faced by not only by those who are left behind, but by the person dying. When the person is dying, one of the things that holds him back is the tremendous grief. And he says that in the future, he says this won't be the case so much. Right now, it's the case that there's tremendous grief when a loved one dies. He says this shouldn't be the way it is. He says in the future, we're going to actually have a celebration at death. The person will plan his death. He'll say, well, my body isn't working that great anymore. It's time for me to go. I'm going to just vacate my body on December 3rd. So I'm going to have a big party on December 2nd, invite all my friends. So he invites all his friends around and they all have, you know, party and tell stories. And then he says, okay, you guys, I really appreciate you showing up and wishing me off. And I'm taking off tomorrow. And I will see you all soon when you're done with your life here. So he takes off the next day and nobody feels bad. Everybody says, well, we know he's gone to a good place to his soul. And so that's...
if you want a lot of people to come, if you want a lot of people to come to your funeral, tell them all, I'll write you a check for $1 million. You'll get a whole bunch of people.
Yeah, it reminds me of a joke. This Christian and Muslim and Jew, they always associate Jews with money, of course, but they all gather to the funeral at the gravesite of a beloved friend. So one of them come up with the idea, well, you know, we ought to show this person we love him a lot, so we'll, he says, I'm going to take $100 bill and throw in his gravesite. And that's my contribution. The other guy says, oh, okay, well, I'll throw in $100 bill. Well, the Jewish fellow, he's pretty wise financially, so he says, I'm going to throw in $100 too. Here's a $300 check, and I'll take the 200. So anyway, that's a cute little joke there. I guess it's politically incorrect to talk about that type of thing these days. Okay. He says, once we've lost our fear of death, communication between the dead and the living will be much easier, so there will be no loss of relationship. Okay, anyone here have any communication with loved ones that have moved on?
Well, loved ones that have moved on don't really know a whole lot more than we do. It's the higher ones that we want to communicate with.
Yeah. Well, you know, there's a lot of on all of us return to the soul. There's a lot of different teachings on that, between a little bit different between regular theosophy and DK's teachings on that. Um, Regular theosophy teaches that we just go into a sleep and we're unconscious, or we go into a dream state. Whereas I think there's a certain amount of truth to that for a period of time, but then when we're reunited with our soul, whether we be a lower or high consciousness, then there's an awakening. There's awakening, and we can then contact the person's soul. But he says, he makes this definite statement that once we have lost our fear of death, communication between the dead and the living will be much easier, and there will be no loss of relationship. So that's an interesting statement that conflicts with a little bit with the way that standard theosophy looks at it. He says, once men have lost their fear of death and have established an understanding of the after-death world, which is not based on hallucination or hysteria, or on conclusions often unintelligent of the average medium, who speaks under the control of her own thought form, built by himself or a circle of sitters. He says, we shall have the process of death properly controlled. He points out that incarnation is actually based on science, and death, as we understand it, is based on ignorance. Now, what does he mean by that? He says that in between lives, our soul actually scientifically plans. There's a science over there on the other side. Now, we think of how much science has developed here upon the earth in just a couple thousand years. Well, think of how much science has developed on the other side, where there's a continuity of everything. They have a science that is developed that is way beyond the science here. And he says there's an actual science that is around planning out our life. And so he says at birth, he says there's a tremendous science involved that planned it and put everything together, built our body and our link, and preparations for entering of our consciousness and planning for our life. He says there's a tremendous science around that. And he says it's just the opposite of death. At death, people don't know what's going to happen. We just die and there's no science behind it. And he says this is a mistake, and we will correct it as time goes on. As more knowledge is acquired here upon the earth, we will apply science to death and make death a lot more pleasant transaction than has been in the past. The first thing to do is to remove the fear of death. The fear of death by a knowledge that there is life after death.
I had 5 years of experience with a medium rare
Oh, yeah.
who told us that there was this science. They described exactly the process and the various levels. And it was different than the average medium because we had instructions on all of these things we're studying today from these authors that we know well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, good. Yeah, there's preparations that should be made, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about. He says, right now we rejoice at birth and sorrow at death, but we need to change our approach. He says, when the seeker sees his time has come, he will be, like I say, gathering his friends around him and having a celebration rather than a time of sorrow where everybody's just miserable. It'll be a little bit like if you send your your a loved one on a vacation to Europe. You're going to miss them. Maybe let's say they're going to go there or maybe take a cruise around the world. They're going to be gone 6 months. You're going to miss them, but you feel good for them because they're going to be enjoying themselves. And this is the attitude that we should have about death. We will miss them temporarily, but we realize they're going to be enjoying themselves probably more than we're enjoying ourselves. He says, before another 100 years has elapsed, an event will take place and a revelation will be given by the race which will turn hope into certainty and belief into knowledge. Okay, this was written about 1934. So 100 years will elapse by 2034. So his prediction is before, that's not that far away now, within 15, 20 years, he's expecting some type of major revelation that will take away the fear of death. So we're approaching that time of that revelation that he talked about. Now he talks about this more thoroughly in another part of his writing. He says that from the densest materialistic thinking on the physical plane in the scientific world will come a point of great light where these atheist type scientists will actually be the ones to discover a means of communicating with the afterlife, a scientific means of communicating with them. Now, I don't know if this is a revelation he's talking about or not, but he says that such an invention will come. And when he talks about this invention, he doesn't say when it will come. But here he says a revelation will come. So I don't know if he's talking about the invention or maybe something else of significant that will turn people to accept an afterlife.
Many esotericists are looking to 2025 for some great revelation.
Yeah, we expect more revelation from the hierarchy around that period of time. I don't know if that will have anything to do with it or not. So it'll be interesting. So anyway, one of the things that is been revealed that wasn't very talked about when DK wrote this is the near-death experiences. There's a lot of them happening, and they're convincing a lot of people that there is life after death. And even people that aren't very religious are kind of considering more that there is life after death, and they keep doing research on this. And the atheist type scientists say, well, this is kind of just a remnant of the brain activity after death, and but a lot of people aren't satisfied with that explanation, and they're looking deeper. And when they look deeper, they find a lot of interesting evidences of people with the near-death experiences of repeated conversations that happen in adjoining rooms that they couldn't have heard, even physically where they were. And sometimes they report what the doctors did or said as he was supposed to have been unconscious. Other times they may have actually visited somebody that was miles away and heard their conversation. And so there's a lot of evidence there that these people have brought back that science cannot explain. And perhaps the near-death experiences that are becoming commonplace are part of the revelation, because back 100 years ago, people didn't talk about near-death experiences very much because they were ridiculed a lot. But because it's becoming more popular to talk about, a lot more people are coming out and talking about them. I don't think it's so much that we have a lot more near-death experiences, but we just or feel a little freer to talk about them than we used to. Yeah, is anyone here at oh yeah.
Yeah, I got a story about a cousin of mine that died. His name was Benny, and he was an outdoors kind of guy, rough and rugged, and liked to was an adventurer kind of a person, and he had a full beard. And one day he shaved it off, and his mother asked him, "Well, why did you shave your beard off, Benny?" And he said, "Well, because when I meet my maker, I want to be clean shaven." Well, the next day, he went scuba diving with a friend, and he had never been scuba diving before, but his friend said, "Well, it's not that hard. You just have to breathe through this apparatus, and you'll catch on easily because you're kind of a natural student for scuba diving." And so Benny said, "Well, okay, I'll strap me on." So they went down in this small lake, and Benny got trapped in seaweed, and he couldn't get out. And in front of his friend, his friend couldn't get him out either, and Benny died. He drowned. And his friend said, "Well, the weirdest thing was that when I looked over and I saw Benny for the last time, he was not alone." He said there was another entity with him, next to him, raising his spirit out of his body and taking him away.
Yeah.
That's the story of Benny, and we all miss Benny to this very day because he was such a good-natured, fun-loving soul.
Is that my sister's son you're talking about?
Yeah, that's your sister's son, Benjamin.
Yeah, my
You
sister.
ever heard that story?
My sister had more spiritual stories to tell about her family. It was kind of interesting. Yeah. Okay.
Like when they burned the trailer down and they saw that entity in the fire. Remember that?
Yeah, they had this. They were building this house, and it went on forever. My brother-in-law, he was the type of guy that just had a hard time completing his great projects. But they were building this beautiful house, and they lived in this small trailer. Finally, my brother-in-law died, and my sister finally got the house finished. And so we all got together, and we were going to burn that trailer down and watch it burn and celebrate the burning of the trailer. So we got there and we burned the trailer down, and I took a picture of it. And the picture had a face in the flames that was really clear. It was like some demon or something.
Probably Lauren Lee mad that he was burning down his trailer.
Yeah, but that was kind of funny. But okay, any other comments or questions before we sign off here? Anybody have any interesting experiences with connecting with loved ones they want to share before we wrap it up? I'll bet you Melba's got some experience.
Oh, yes.
Well, tell us one, Melba.
Well, I have a picture sitting on top of a bookcase. It's a really high bookcase. And it's
Could you talk just a little bit louder?
Oh, sure. Let me turn the volume up. Is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. I have a picture of my daughter. She took her last selfie before she died. And I was telling Mindy about it the other day when we were talking on the phone. And I never noticed it until today because we printed it out on portrait paper. And behind her, there's like this big white cloud. And then there's like a little cherub with a bow and angel, a bow and arrow. And then right up in the corner, there's like two different skulls like looking out. It was just really just the oddest thing because I never paid attention to it, but it fell off the top of the bookcase.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I picked it up and was looking at it. But you know, when my dad died, we're getting ready to take stuff to the funeral home. And the front door to the living room, we have a porch door, then we have a living room door. And that door just flung open and hit the wall. And I'm like, hey, Dad, how you doing? And all of a sudden, pictures that were way on top of this bookcase of my dad, like when he was 2 years old, picture of him and when he was 17 and in the Navy, all these started falling off the top.
I mean, just on their own with nobody doing anything?
Nobody doing anything. Nobody was even near it. All of a sudden, they're on the floor, and I said, oh, you want us to take these pictures to the funeral home? I said, okay. Picked them up, and we took them. But, you know, one thing, my mom had Alzheimer's, and I was moved out to Boise. She was there towards the end of her life, and I'm driving in Boise one day, and all of a sudden I felt my mother's presence in the car beside me, and it was just me and her. And I said, I mean, it was really strong. There was no doubt in my mind. And I said, hey, Mom, how are you doing? And she goes, and she said, I mean, it was more like I was hearing it in my mind. She goes, well, I just wanted to see what you were doing. I wanted to see how you are. I said, well, would you like to see some Boise? So we drove around a little bit, and then all of a sudden, whew, she was gone.
Yeah.
Wow.
Interesting. Well,
Yeah.
I figured you'd have a story or two for us. Okay, any other? Great. Thanks a lot, Melva. Any other comments or questions before we close her up for the day?
Well, when Paramahansa was, before he died, he was at a meeting, at a dinner for the ambassador of India, and sitting at a table, and he bid everyone goodbye, and he slumped over consciously, and he was dead.
That'd be kind of weird, wouldn't it?
Well, he knew he was leaving, and he bid everyone adieu. And you know the story that his body was held without preservation or embalmment for 40 days or so, and never putrefied.
Yeah, you know, there's stories of saints that have had that happen too. That's kind of interesting. And okay, anything else?
Well, my mother died back in 1906, and when I was away one day, I had a roommate who was home, and he was sort of almost blind, but he said my mother came to the door after she'd passed away the next day and was asking for Eddie, you know, and she's the only one that ever called me that.
Really?
So she came after passing away. She came looking for me.
So that was an interesting sign that she called you Eddie, huh? Yeah. Well, we'll have to start calling you Eddie.
I have one more story, JJ.
Oh, okay.
All right. This was a dream I had, and it was back in the 1990s, and I was in nursing school at the time. And I had this dream that I was at a party, and, you know, people are talking and everything, but I'm not really talking to anybody. And there was this man there, and he was real thin, and he was bald. And his face was really orange. And all of a sudden he fell over, and I'm yelling, hey, we need to do CPR here. This guy he just died. Somebody get over here and help me. And I woke up from the dream, came out to my parents the next day, and I was telling them about the dream. And they exchanged these significant looks. And I was like, what's going on? And they said, well, we weren't going to tell you, but your Uncle Les died last night, And when they found him, his face was orange. And I
Really?
said, yeah, he'd had some liver disease. And they said, I said, well, I think I was with him.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stories around uh, life after death, and people. I think that Tibetan is right that by around the year 2034, a lot more people will accept that life continues in some form. Okay, well, it's great to have you all here today, and we next week is the gathering, so it'll be 2 weeks before we have another class, and we will see you one place or another.
See you guys at the gathering.
See you at the
Life, light, and
gathering.
love.
Let's all gather in the
Bye,
call.
buddy.
See you soon.
Take care.
Right.
Thanks,
Bye,
Jacob.
See you
Bye,
guys in the
Annie.
flesh.
Bye, Deanie.